had to get over there and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, welcome to the Word I Heard podcast right here on Emmanuel Mennonite's YouTube channel. I gotta adjust a little bit. Everything's kind of messed up from all over there. Hey, welcome back.
Yes.
We weren't here last week, were we?
No, we weren't.
I can't even remember. It is Holy Week. And, I remember what I was doing. I was getting ready and had to go and do a few things. But this week, big change in my life. I got my hearing aids.
Oh, wow.
And so I forget that they're in. And I had asked him, because of the podcast and everything, I'd asked him, I said, I spend a lot of time with headphones on. What do you do? He said, take the hearing aids out.
Ah.
I have forgotten to do that. So I have my hearing aids in. And so the nice thing about it is that I can go in on an app and turn them down.
Nice.
So I need to do that real quick. There we go. Well, that's very different. How about that right there?
Wow.
We'll turn them down. So I'm getting used to that. That's a big lifestyle change for me. Not being able to hear and then all of a sudden being able to hear is quite shocking. I was telling a number of people, you hear things that you haven't heard in a long time, and they scare me.
Yes.
And so I'm sure there's a biblical message in that somehow. But for those of you who are new to the Word I Heard podcast, this is Good Friday. I'm Pastor Derek Hutchison. I'm the pastor at Emmanuel. And this is Elder Mark Fisher. And he is an elder here at Emmanuel Mennonite. And every week we come together and we discuss the sermon of last week. We weren't here last week. I don't even remember that. But if I recall, the sermon from last week was about Mary.
Yes.
Okay, so it's Palm Sunday. That's
Yes.
the one we're talking about.
Yes.
I can never remember where we're at. Once it gets to Holy Week, we had Maundy Thursday last night. We were talking a little bit about that before we went on air. What were your thoughts of Maundy Thursday? No sermon, but just a time together. What did you think?
I talked to a couple people beforehand and let them know a little what to expect.
A little warning in
Yes.
advance, yeah.
And so part of it was what we were used to,
Mm-hmm.
and the Monday, Thursday part, and then the part that was new was all the part on the Old Testament where the
Right.
Passover feast. And so having that added to the context of Monday, Thursday made it richer.
Right, and it was a little different for those of you who might be listening who went. You'll know, for those of you who weren't able to attend, it was a little bit of what I had done was tried to integrate some of the Seder meal into, as well as some of the liturgy, into our time together. We had the bitter herbs, we had the horsett, we had the green herbs and the salt water, and of course the tears and the bitterness and the mortar, all of the reminding the Jewish people of their slavery, integrated into what we did was to take basically Mark 14 and just read the story as it went and experience those things. So it was a little bit different to have communion right off the bat. It just started, but that's the way it went. And I wanted to be able to say, we're experiencing what we see in Scripture, the same things that went on that night we're experiencing. So we basically started with communion and went all the way to Peter's tears after denying Christ. And that's where we let ourselves go that night on Maundy Thursday. And then we get today to Good Friday. And and this weekend. I wanted to ask you, especially in the Mennonite church, and of course I'm always trying to learn new things about the Mennonite church, but even in the Quaker church, is there a concentration on days within this Holy Week in the Quaker church as much in the Mennonite church? The idea of, I know that we celebrate Maundy, Thursday, but the idea of really following Christ through that week, Maundy, Thursday, a Good Friday service, is that followed in the Quaker church at all?
Quakers tend to be very non-liturgical, and so they talk about different things like Easter and Christmas and different holidays, but they wouldn't do the outward observances. And so when I went from the Quaker church to the Mennonite church, one of the first surprises I had was Maundy, Thursday.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know about it. I knew about the Last Supper, but that term wasn't familiar. And so the first time I went to a Maundy, Thursday service, I didn't know what to expect. And so that's been a routine thing now for many years, and it's very meaningful.
And if you can remember, what was that like? What was that like, that first Maundy, Thursday? Not knowing to happen.
Well, my first thought was, what do Monday and Thursday have to do with each other?
Monday, yeah, that's right.
And yesterday when you explained Monday, Thursday being the mandate, I always thought of Monday, Thursday as sorrowful Thursday. And
right.
And so it really reminded me that I had the wrong idea for the name. And so that was good to have that reminder that we're to love one another.
I think that's probably one of the biggest questions that I always get is, why do we call it Maundy, Thursday? That whole idea of the Latin of mandatum, that command that Christ gives us to love one another. And so why, and I know I'm picking at things that we probably don't ever talk about, but I'm so curious about, especially in the Quaker church, why not the celebration of that?
When the Quaker movement first started, there was a lot of, in other churches, whether it be baptisms and different things, and lives wouldn't change. And so I think the idea was, at the time, they didn't do the outward observances because they weren't being done in a meaningful way. And so they would focus on the inward realities. But I find out that those outward observances can be very meaningful. And we're people that are used to things that we can see, touch, taste.
Right.
The senses have a way of making these things more meaningful. And these are things that Christ told us to do. So it's good to do those things.
And I remember you telling me about that whole idea of saying, we're doing these things and we're not changing. So why do them?
Yeah.
If they don't affect our lives, if they don't have a meaningful impact, then we're just kind of wasting time. Which, when we talked about that earlier, I thought to myself, that has a lot of merit.
Yes.
It really does. Is the whole idea, just like last night? If not that one night is going to change your life, but if things like this don't get us to think, don't get us to move, don't get us to at least address things, change is hard. If it doesn't cause us to do that, then are we wasting precious time, I guess? And so I see that, because there is that danger, and I always think about that when we do things like this. The danger of, we do it because it's tradition. And some things we just do because they're tradition. We just do. But that doesn't mean that it can't change. But there is a real danger, I think, especially in the church, of doing things because we've always done them before. There was a great book, I remember when I first started in youth ministry, and I wish I knew who wrote it. there's a great book that came out probably in the late 80s, 90s, I think. Not quite sure. It was a book called Sacred Cows Make Tasty Hamburgers. And it was the idea of looking at your church for what a sacred cow was. That idea of the things that we just do because that's the way we did it. And I think when we get in times like this, Holy Week, the tradition, and I'm one that's like that. The first thing I wanted to know, and I always, for those who are watching who may not know, that I'm still in my first year cycle here, not just to a new church, to a new denomination. And so every time I experience a new thing, I go and ask, what do we do? We have sunrise service coming up Sunday morning, and we have Maundy, Thursday last night. And so it was very important for me. I don't know how many times I asked you. Last night we did, and this is kind of a segue that I want to get into. We did something last night during Maundy, Thursday that is very traditional, not only in the Mennonite Church in a form, but to this church. And as I said before, as we got through the book of, as we went through the book of Mark, we took a little detour to the book of John. It kept the same, schedule, you would say, or itinerary at the Passover, but we got to the foot washing, when Jesus washes the feet of the disciples and what we hear Jesus say. And we did hand washing. And of course, foot washing is from what I understand, a very common thing in the Mennonite Church. And last night we did hand washing. So 2 questions for you. One, you talk about coming in from the Quaker side. First time you came to that, what was your reaction? And is it okay that I'm still not comfortable with that? Not as this is a terrible non-theological thing, not at all. Very physically, just as a person, uncomfortable. Now the hand washing last night, no, because we broke into pairs and it was me and my wife. But is it okay?
With the foot washing, a lot of things that I think have been traditional sometimes maybe get to be less of a tradition. And so the foot washing, really the only time we've done it is for Maundy, Thursday, and it hasn't been done all the time. And so it's one of those type of things we kind of worked into it. And then we thought, well, what's something we can do to make more people take part in it? So that's when we went from foot washing to hand washing. And so I find that the foot washing is very meaningful. The hand washing has very much the same feeling. It's not quite as intimate as foot washing.
Right.
But it still has the same feeling of blessing one another and serving one another. And so, and I've noticed with the hand washing, we probably get about double the participation. So that helps.
And I think there's a safety in it, the way that we did it. At least you could partner up with somebody, and of course, anyone who didn't want to participate didn't. I mean, it wasn't like, okay, now you go line up and you're going to do it. It wasn't that. If you wanted to do it, you could do it, and I'd say 75%, 80, even maybe more, participated in it and felt comfortable with. And as that was going on, and I think out of everything, being my first time trying to get a Maundy, Thursday together, putting that in, I think that's one of the reasons I went with Mark, is because there's my outline. I don't get to skip. I don't get to skip that. It's part of the story. We've got to put that in. But I thought about that as I was preparing Maundy, Thursday, and actually last night, just how meaningful it was that night with Jesus and the disciples, even though that was a very common thing. That's what people do. You wash your feet because of the dust that was gathered as people. And so it was very much a common thing and probably not as strange as we look at it today. But it is meaningful, intimate. I mean, all of those things. And just that fact of having to go through that made me think about that story differently. And I thought that was not something that I thought was going to happen or to be a part of any of that. And so, do Quakers do that?
No.
And it's interesting to me, the reason I bring that up is because that's kind of it's the thing that connects the discussion a little bit of you coming from one denomination into the Mennonite church and me coming from obviously being in the Presbyterian church into this and seeing some of the different things that they do and some of the different thoughts.
Now, in saying no, there were some exceptions. I remember times where, as a Quaker doing communion, I remember as a Quaker in college having somebody baptize me. And so those were type of things that I think if a person would have done it, I don't think they would have been condemned. It wasn't a normal practice. And so I'm trying to think of any instance where I remember foot washing, and I really don't remember that as something we did.
Yeah, and the only time that I've been familiar with it was obviously I've been to some weddings that I think I may have even officiated at a wedding. It was not very common, but it does happen. It's becoming more and more common at weddings, weddings of individuals who really want to experience that, where the bride and the groom wash each other's feet, and even saying it sounds, strange, I guess is the word. So
you would expect those two things to go together,
right?
But there's something very powerful about symbols, about sacraments, where you're actually doing what you're reading and
right.
experiencing it makes it more real, makes it more meaningful, because you're going through what you're reading, you're experiencing that experience, and that's the power of foot washing, hand washing, communion, all those things. It just makes it, using all your senses, just makes it hit home and hit at a deeper level.
Right. And I think because of our, for lack of a better word, institutionalizing of some of the sacraments that we read about, just pure logistics of how we have to do it. We miss kind of, and last night, of course, during communion, I said the words of institution and broke the bread and then gave the bread to all of you, and you basically just served it. You passed the bread around. And in reality, that's what happened at that time. Jesus didn't stand at the foot and like I would do, and Peter and James came up and they were the ones, and they served, and they had the little cup and all. That wasn't the way it happened. It was part of the Passover meal, that dipping of the bread in the wine, the 5 dips, and all of those types of things. And I think we miss that. The intimacy of just serving one another. And sometimes people feel weird about that. They're like, I don't know that I can't serve you communion.
Yeah.
I can't give you the bread. That's Derek's job. That's the elder's job. And of course, no, it isn't.
Well, and best I could tell last night when it happened, people seemed comfortable with it.
Yes.
I didn't sense any hesitation. Nobody all of a sudden kind of gave a funny look or hesitated. And so, it was something that's, people are used to passing things around. So even though it was done a little different way, I'm sure it made it more authentic that way.
Yeah, and you kind of look at it as that. Okay, this is probably what went on. This was, just like, hey, here's Jesus. It was and of course, within those stories, there are symbols. Jesus used that symbology. He says, "This is my body." Of course, it isn't. This is a loaf of bread. but Jesus said, "This is when you do this, do in remembrance of me." The cup, the things that sat on the table. It was a rather probably, I would imagine, the first time. I don't know that any of the other Maundy Thursdays tables looked that way. It was pretty packed.
Yes.
It was a busy table. There were a number of things. We did it by candlelight, and of course we had the three different things on there, and the bulletin, and then of course your plate and all. And so it was a busy table.
And that was a good way to keep it from being too routine. When you do the things you do and then you add things to it, mix it up a little bit, I think it kind of has a way of making you pay attention even to the familiar, because then the
Right.
familiar and the new kind of blend together. And so your way of getting the familiar and adding to it, I think it's a good way to keep things from being too routine or too much,
Yeah.
where you just do it because you do it.
Yeah, and I think that carries through with Sunday coming up,
Yeah.
with Easter and all, and that's what I've tried to do as we've talked about these sermons, and in our last 10 minutes here, I know I've kind of shorted the sermon, but that's what I've tried to do is to take all of these stories, especially these women of the Bible, and tilt them a little bit to a different perspective, and of course. Last week's sermon, as I said during the sermon, we started with Eve, we end with Mary, and it just seems right. Did I go where you thought I was going to go? And of course, the title of the sermon was "A Love of a Parent."
I expected just to have you talk about Mary, but when you talked about other parents, that was
Yeah.
good, because it
Yeah.
made you realize that what Mary experienced. There are other examples in the Bible, Abraham offering
Yeah.
Isaac, which I've always struggled with. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
if I was in Abraham's shoes, I'd be thinking, this has got to be the devil talking to me.
Exactly. This doesn't sound like
yeah.
something God would want me to do.
Yeah.
And that's a great, and of course, the hook that I had, if you can call it that, I know that's kind of a rough word, but of course that's the word we use in speaking, is where's my hook? And the hook was the donkey.
Yeah.
The donkey was the hook, of course, as Jesus rode in on the colt, and of course as Abraham packed up the donkey with the firewood to, and if I remember anything from the sermon, I remember the line of two fathers sending their sons, three parents really, if you
Yeah.
think about it, sending their sons to potential sacrifices. Obviously, God the Father asking of Isaac, and Abraham sending his son, and Mary just watching her son. And whether or not we have to assume she knew it was coming. She knew that something was going to happen. But that idea of a parent watching their child be cheered and lifted up at the pinnacle, and unavoidably being proud. I'm sure she was. She could not have missed that. I mean, but in the back of her mind, knowing this isn't going to last. The more important thing is coming. And that thing is and to know that that's what's going to happen. Tragically, it's terribly sad.
She knew that from the beginning when Jesus was dedicated to the temple, and she was told that this would basically break her heart, pierce her heart. And
Yes.
So I'm sure all along she kept wondering when is this going to happen, and
Right.
how is it going to happen, and
Right.
And so she got to see this played out and realize, okay, this is what I was told from the beginning.
Yeah, and that the faithfulness, and so we talked about the faithfulness of Mary, and how her greatest joy and greatest sorrow came back to back in just a week, which doesn't happen very often with a parent. If you were to ask a parent what was your greatest joy with that you experienced with a child, and what was your greatest sorrow, they would be decades apart probably. And Mary gets it back to back. And so an interesting woman of the Bible. And so in totality, as we went through Lent, as we made our way through Lent, what was your reaction or interpretation of what that Lent was about as far as the women of the Bible? It's a strange pairing. It's a strange marriage to do that, and I did it, and I thought, the women of the Bible isn't a very common Lenten study, but we went there. What were your thoughts about the whole series and Lent in general?
When you first mentioned you were doing Women of the Bible, I thought that would be a interesting topic.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when you started getting the women involved in it,
Yeah.
it mixed up a little bit more, but it also gave different perspectives where a lot of times we had two sermons for the price of one,
Right, yeah.
which was cool. And then you would tie them together. And so I am sure it made it a little trickier for
Yeah.
you, but it also made it more meaningful. And so, yeah, you wouldn't think of Women of the Bible as a Lenten exercise.
Right.
For me, for Lent, I felt like I should have done more. I felt like somehow I was just caught away with everything. But even though I didn't do a lot of quote unquote Lenten activities,
Right.
I did my usual part in the morning where I would go through my utmost for His highest,
Mm-hmm.
and then reading
Is
the
that
Bible.
Oswald Chambers?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I did my usual stuff, but what it did was it made me think of how am I serving God and how can I draw closer. And so it was not a typical Lenten experience, but it was compatible with it because Lent is all about looking at our lives and offering up ourselves as a living sacrifice where we draw closer to God and pay attention to what's going on in this season of what we're remembering.
And that's interesting that you say that, and that was one of the reasons. And I'll kind of tell you the impetus of the whole thing, I guess, as far as thinking about women for Lenten study and really using the idea of or at least I'm going to talk about women of the Bible, and then having other women come up and talk about the women that they look at in the Bible. It really was that whole Lenten thing was about perspective to me. I'll tell you how it happened. It happened really because as early in the morning when I get here and get ready for the podcast, and sometimes I do video announcements for the churches, and there was one time that I was here and I was trying to get the lighting right and I was trying to get the camera right, and the camera moved just a little bit, and it wasn't that I adjusted it, it just moved, and it changes the perspective of what I see on these cameras. And for some reason at that moment, this idea of that camera just moved a little, it didn't twist, it didn't turn, it just moved a tad and changed the whole picture. And then, as strange as that seems, I thought to myself, I wonder if I do that with the women of the Bible that I see, if I take that story and just turn it a little bit. And that's how it started. And so I used that for my Lenten exercise to say, every day I get up and I look in the mirror and I evaluate my life as a Christian in that mirror. But what if I just turn my life just a little and I look at my life from a different perspective? Instead of looking at the things that I always look at Lent, what if I look at it from a different angle? And out of that came a day of fasting on Wednesday, and this idea of how often do I get into the scripture? How often do I stop and pray? What does this mean we talk about it in our elders meeting. We've talked about it in Sunday school. We talk about this idea of praying without ceasing, and what does that mean, and how. And so that's it. All started with an accidental movement of a camera.
Wow.
For me, for Lent, and that was my a very different Lent for me this year than ever. You know, I think a lot of the times you're like, okay, I've got this Lenten exercise book. There are questions here. I'll answer them and that's great. But when you do that over and over and over and over and over, and it's like we talk about that tradition or the type of thing, it loses it. And all we have to do is just turn it. Now, there is uneasiness when that happens, because I took Palm Sunday and talked about a donkey. And some people will say, yeah, that's not what we do on Palm Sunday. You don't talk about donkeys. Mm-hmm. We talk about Jesus' triumphant entry. And what's there? It's just from the perception and the perspective of the donkey and or Mary and her eyes. And some people don't like to tilt Scripture and look at it from a different perspective. So I'm wondering how that was heard and received in the congregation, and how you experienced it. But before we go, we've got a few minutes left. I do want to talk, if we have just 3 minutes left. You are going to be in the pulpit on Sunday, April 7th here at Emmanuel Mennonite. You want to make sure that you're here. I'm going to be gone. That's my birthday weekend. Christine and I always go and do something. We go out of town and take a break. I'm just glad this year that it is right after Holy Week, because Holy Week is a busy, stressful time.
Yes.
And I need to recharge my batteries. But you're going to be in the pulpit, and what are you going to be talking about?
King David.
King David. And so that is, and I'm hoping that we'll be able, that we'll have someone here that, because most of the time, if the other gentleman who helps me with the live stream isn't here, I do it, but I'm not going to be here. I'm hoping he's going to be there. Either way, we're going to be able to live stream it. I'm going to be able to see it, and then I get to come back on that Friday after April 7th, and I get to say, this is what I heard.
Yes.
This is what I heard. So I'm very excited for you, and I, you know, I don't want to give away anything, but this is, I think this is something you have felt, that this is on your heart. This is a story that is meaningful to you. And so I'm very excited for you, and very proud of you for standing up there and doing it. This isn't something that 95% of the congregation would volunteer to do. It's very, and so I'm very much looking forward to this sermon on King David. Does it have a title yet?
Probably the closest thing I can think of a title is David, a man after God's own heart. I thought early on about sinner or saint, or kind of what type of man is David.
Right.
And so I don't have the title nailed down. I guess that's one thing I got to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. I usually do it the other way around. I usually come up with just the title. For example, I'm still working on the Easter. And again, I wanted to end Holy Week. I wanted to end our time, this time of Lent, through Holy Week. And so I figure if I'm going to make people uncomfortable in the pews, then what better day to do it than on Easter? So this Easter is obviously tilted just like everything else. And the title of the sermon is Tomorrow, not today.
Yes.
It's tomorrow. And so we look at it. We look at that crucifixion, that resurrection, this whole Holy Week, what we've experienced, and we turn it just a tad. I've included the story about the camera and how I got to the point of perspective, and so I think people will, and I think people are getting used to, okay, Derek's going to tilt it a little bit. He's going to tell us something I've never
Yeah.
never heard of, and I don't know if I'm going to agree with it, but we're excited about it. But we've got Holy Week. If you don't have a church, if you're looking for a church to come to on Sunday, I know a lot of people wait. Some people come to church on Christmas and Sunday, or Christmas and Easter. Some people come all the time. But if you're looking for a church and you think, you know what, it's Easter Sunday, I think I'm gonna go to church. Emmanuel Mennonite is a great place to come. We're at 5th and Harriet here in La Junta. Our services start at 9:30. We've got a whole bunch of things going on. We've got a sunrise service that starts at 6:30 out at a congregational member's home. A few minutes. Then we come back for a breakfast at 8:15, and then we have the Sunday service. Included in that is a baptism. So it's a packed Sunday. And I would invite all of you to put that down on your calendar to make sure that you're here. And if you're looking for a church, Emmanuel Mennonite is a great church. So for everybody here at Emmanuel, we hope to see you on Sunday. For Mark, for myself, thanks for joining us. We'll see you next Friday. And we'll talk about the Easter sermon and see what you think. So have a great week, and we will see you on next Friday. God bless.